If your algorithm is anything like mine, then the past few weeks have been filled with the Odyssey. Whether it's Benny Safdie's Darth Vader-esque aura, Robert Pattinson's sniveling screed against the unhoused, or translator Emily Wilson's oddly vindictive takedown of the film, the Odyssey has achieved a rare monocultural moment in today's fractured media landscape. But if your algorithm is anything like mine, and I have to assume it is because you are watching or listening to this, then you've probably also seen quite a bit about another story. This article in The Atlantic by Rose Horowitz called "The End of Reading is Here." What I'm going to do today is talk about Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which I read as part of the Shoulda Book Club. I'm going to compare that to the Christopher Nolan film. And then I'm also going to try to take a look at how some of the storytelling techniques of the Odyssey are more relevant than ever in a society that's not really reading books anymore. That's what we're going to do on today's episode of Shoulda Books. Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today we are talking about the Odyssey. We're specifically talking about the Emily Wilson translation. This is the most recent translation, and it's what we read as part of the Shoulda Book Club in July. If you want to join the Shoulda Book Club, you can do so over on Fable. And if you love this show, if you love this podcast, and you want to support it, you can do so over on Patreon. For $4.99 a month, you get early, ad-free, extended episodes of Shoulda Books. You get exclusive access to our Discord server, and you also get bonus content. And you help me keep the lights on. So I really appreciate those of you who have joined, and encourage the rest of you to do so as well. All right, let's get into this episode. So the Odyssey, you know this story, whether you have read this translation, whether you have seen the blockbuster film, you know this story. It is one of the foundational texts of Western civilization. It's my earliest memory of it. I was really racking my brain as I was prepping this episode to try to figure out which one came first. Was it Arthur's version of the Odyssey, or was it Wishbone's version of the Odyssey? I think probably, and this is based on nothing other than vibes, I didn't look up air dates or anything like that, based purely on vibes, I think that Wishbone's was first. Now, if you have not watched Wishbone since you were a child, let me be the first to encourage you to leave it that way, because that show, it's rough. It's rough to check that out. I would not say that it holds up. Specifically, this adaptation of the Odyssey, the only things that they keep in it are Calypso and the suitors. That's pretty much it. Like, there's no Cyclops, there's no Lotus, there's no Charybdis, there's no Scylla. Anyway, the Arthur version, in contrast, I would say, still holds up. Shout out Crazy Bus. It's been stuck in my head for the past couple weeks. Michaela, I'm sorry for the amount of times that I have sung it around the apartment. If somehow you don't know this story, it's, guy goes to war, he gets lost on the way home, he spends 10 years trying to find his way back home, finally does, takes vengeance on the people who have disrespected him. It feels like it can't be spoiled. I hate spoilers so much, and I hate being the person who has spoiled things. I have spoiled things for people in the past, and the guilt still haunts me. So whenever I'm prepping one of these episodes, whenever I'm going into one of these books, I'm always so walking on eggshells, trying not to spoil anything. But you know what? Today I can let my damn hair down, because there's really no way to spoil this, right? But let's talk about this translation specifically, the Emily Wilson translation. So I chose this one because, one, it is the only translation of the Odyssey that has been done by a woman, and I think that's cool. And it's also the most recent. It's kind of the most up-to-date version. And it's also one that Christopher Nolan, kind of in the build-up to the film, talked about reading and really liking. And we'll get into how Wilson herself responded to the film later in the episode. But this translation, when I picked this thing up at the bookstore, I was like, oh boy. This is a feeling that has happened a couple times in the run of this show, where I choose a book based on the polls that I gave you guys. So thank you all for voting. But I choose a book, I pick up the book, and I realize, fucking hell, this thing's 500 pages long. How am I going to do this in a month? And maybe you've thought the same thing. But I picked this up and I was like, oh boy, this is 500 pages and it's an ancient text. It's going to be esoteric. It's going to be hard to parse. It's going to be hard to follow. I am in for a month of pain. And nothing could be further from the truth. So first of all, there is a very, very hefty introduction that and translator's note that takes up the first 90 pages of this book or so. And I usually don't read the introductions because see above about spoilers. But for this one, I was like, look, I'm going to need all the help I can get. Let me read the introduction. And I really enjoyed what Wilson had to say. She talks about her decision to render Homer's text in modern, very up-to-date English. And she talks about how there's a temptation when you're translating ancient works to make it sound, Victorian, for lack of a better term, to use big, fancy, somewhat archaic language to convey a sense of grandeur, to convey a sense of epicness, I guess. But she talks about how 19th and early 20th century English is no closer to the original Greek than the English that you and I are speaking today. So why not? Why not make this as accessible as possible? And she did an amazing job of doing that. This book, it went down so smooth. Like once I got to the text of the poem, it was a busy month, so I didn't have a whole lot of extended periods of time where I could sit down and read. But when I did sit down and read, like I was trucking, and I was amazed at how alive it felt. I was amazed at how visceral it felt and how accurate and timeless some of its observations on human nature, on human interactions are. And I really loved some of the turns of phrase. Obviously, that is a big work. That is a big job of the translator, preserving that poetic sense without taking too much editorialization. I have not read other translations of the Odyssey, so I don't have another English translation to compare this to. So if you are a big fan of one of the other translations, let me know in the comments what your thoughts are if you've read both of them. I'm probably not going to go back and read a different translation. I'm just not. But I am curious to see some of those differences. But this translation, it is so almost effortless, it feels. Like it really does feel like you are listening to a story, which obviously is how this book, how this poem. Quick note, when I'm referencing the original text, I always kind of have this internal hesitation of, do I call it a poem? Do I call it the text? Do I call it a book? Which one sounds least pretentious? I don't know. I'm going to call it the book because I read it in physical paper format, but perhaps there's a different term one could use. But reading this book, I was really impressed with some of the turns of phrase. This is from book 20, and it says, quote, "So his heart held firm and constant, but he writhed around, as when a man rotates a sausage full of fat and blood, the huge fire blazes, and he longs to have the roasting finished." That's just one example, but I have been in that situation where I am cooking specifically sausage. I'm cooking bratwurst, and the fat is spurting out, and the flames are rising up, and it's hot, and I'm like, man, this is going to be delicious, but I can't wait to be done. And I just to encounter a text that is thousands of years old and just have that feeling that some things don't change is a very special feeling, and I got that a lot reading this translation. Now, as I've said before, this is a story that we all kind of know. And I was amazed and kind of bummed a little bit to find out that some of the passages that loom the largest for me are maybe half a page long. One of those stories is The Land of the Lotus Eaters. This was featured in the Arthur version, hilariously. And it's one of those metaphors that I've used just in my own personal life a lot, the idea of lotus eaters. And I was, the whole time I'm like, okay, I can't wait till we get to this section and have all these amazing insights about numbing oneself and blissing out and ignoring the harsh realities of the world. It's like a paragraph. It is such a blip. And I was a little bummed. I was a little bummed about that. A lot of the kind of hallmark scenes, the big scenes that you think of, like the Whirlpool Charybdis and the monster Scylla, very quick. Does not take up that much ink in the story. Instead, pages upon pages upon pages are dedicated to Odysseus in the hall of the Phaeacians. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, where he is doing Olympic-style games and listening to bards sing and stuff like that. And so I was surprised to see that some of my favorite scenes were so small, and some scenes that I had no idea about and frankly found kind of boring did take up more space than I would have liked. But even the kind of boring stuff, especially when they start listing off people's names and you're just like, I do not know who the hell that is. It doesn't last that long. And again, the pace is so quick, you move right through it. And another thing that was surprising to me is how much of the story takes place after Odysseus gets back to Ithaca. The text is divided into 24 books, 24 chapters basically, and he gets back to Ithaca in chapter 13. So really when he gets home, it's the midpoint. So as I was reading this, I was trying to put myself in the shoes of someone hearing this around the time of its composition. So the Odyssey was likely composed in the 8th or 7th century BC, but it's most likely based on an oral tradition that goes back hundreds of years even before that. So these were stories that were already kind of, handed down generation to generation, with people making little changes and little tweaks before it kind of reached its final form that we know and love today. Whether or not any of the events depicted in the Odyssey or the Iliad, the other epic poem attributed to Homer, it is a huge matter of debate. It's beyond the scope of this podcast. It does appear that there was a city named Troy, or at least in the region where they say that Troy was, and it does appear to have been sacked in the 12th century BC. But as far as any specifics, as far as any of the characters mentioned in the Odyssey, it's really a matter. It's an unknowable question as to whether any of these people actually existed, and whether or not there was a person named Odysseus, whether or not there was a horse. There probably wasn't, but it's fun to think that maybe there was. Whether Homer was a real person or not is another debate that scholars have been having for hundreds of years. The Homeric question is the name for it. And, I don't think anyone's ever going to actually know. Homer may have been a real person, could have been a man, could have been a woman, could have been kind of a committee of people. We just don't know. We probably never will. So the Trojan War might have happened. There might have been dudes like Achilles and Odysseus who might have done some cool stuff. But whatever happened, those stories get told and then retold and then retold. And each time it changes just a little bit. And that is true today with the most recent retelling of this story, Christopher Nolan's version of the Odyssey. Okay, let's talk about the dang movie. Cards on the table. I loved it. I really, really enjoyed this movie. I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan. Just look at me. You could tell that that's probably going to be the case. When I saw Inception in the theaters, that was when I was like, I want to be a filmmaker. I don't know, something clicked for me watching that movie. And I've been a fan of his for a very long time. But I do think that this movie is like a new step in, technically it's a new step in technology. It's the first movie to be completely shot on IMAX. I think that it is just an incredible feat. I do think it's not a perfect movie. We'll get into some of my complaints with the movie, but I do think that it is just, I saw it in IMAX. I didn't see it in 70 millimeter IMAX. I'm sorry. I wish I could, but it's really hard to do so. And that brings up a whole other debate about, this kind of premium format and the ticket masterification of every sort of form of entertainment. And I can't get started on that because then this episode will completely go off the rails, much like Odysseus's journey, and we can't have that. So the movie, I really enjoyed it. I thought it worked as a spectacle as a blockbuster. I mean, I'm seeing stuff that I've never seen before, and that is exciting. I think it worked as a story, as a human beings going through hardship and fighting for what they love and care about. I thought it worked on that level. I thought the performances were, as good as they needed to be. I wasn't necessarily blown away by anybody, but I also didn't find anyone to be, annoyingly bad. Everyone was good. Everyone was good. And I also really appreciated it on a political level, because I think that the political statement that the film is making, I think, is very relevant and pointed, and is something that, needs to be said on the biggest stage that there is. And this movie is like breaking box office records. So many people are seeing it, and I'm glad for that. And we'll get into kind of my thoughts on the kind of political nature of it later. But let's talk about how it compares to the text. So I saw this movie opening night. I was about halfway through reading at that point. So I had to finish reading to catch up to find out what had changed and what had stayed the same. A lot of it is accurate to the text. Obviously, it's a 2.5 hour movie, so they can't include everything. Odysseus meeting Nausicaa and Alcinous and Arete, that's all cut. But kind of all of the things that you expect to be in there are in there. Obviously, the Cyclops, obviously, Charybdis and Scylla, Circe. Some of them have some tweaks, though. So one of the biggest changes that I think Nolan made has to do with the character of Odysseus. In the text, Odysseus is portrayed as this very clever, schemy guy. He's a trickster. In the movie, there's an element of that, but it's not like his biggest attribute. And the place where that's on display the most obviously is with the Cyclops scene. So in the book, famously, Odysseus, he talks to the Cyclops, and the Cyclops asks him what his name is, and he says nobody or no man, depending on the translation. And so once Odysseus and his men blind the Cyclops, then the Cyclops is freaking out. The other Cyclopses come and they're like, "Hey, what's going on, buddy? What's happening?" And he says, "No man is hurting me." And so the other Cyclopses go, "Oh, well, he's clearly crazy. Let's go on." And they walk away. And so Odysseus is able to escape because of that. And then as he's leaving, he can't help himself. His ego gets the better of him. And he says, "Hey, Cyclops, my name is Odysseus," which then seals him and his men's fate, because now the Cyclops knows who blinded him, and he calls out to his papa, Poseidon, and then that's what incurs the wrath of Poseidon. So that's how it goes in the book. And in the movie, that is not what happens. And look, I get why Nolan changed that, because that kind of pun, that kind of whimsical wordplay, it just doesn't work in Nolan's world. Like, his films and his sensibility is so cerebral, so kind of logical, that in his version, if Odysseus pulled that, the Cyclops would be like, "No man is hurting me," and the other Cyclopses would be like, "What?" And he would be like, "Oh yeah, the guy said his name was No Man. There's a guy in here. He hurt me. He said his name was No Man," and the others would go, "Oh, got it." So like, I get why it was changed, because it would just completely change the tone of the film. Where I think it hurts the film, though, is that it doesn't quite show that hubris. It doesn't show that Odysseus's ego like really gets the better of him and then ends up ruining his chances of coming home and damning his men to a watery grave, because that's what pisses off Poseidon. In the movie, it's kind of implied a little bit more. I think that the "no man, nobody" like line could have worked in a different version. Maybe Guillermo del Toro's The Odyssey, but the Christopher Nolan one, probably not. So I mentioned that I liked the political statement that this movie is making. What I think that statement is it's a commentary on what America and kind of, Western European powers in general have done to other nations, to developing nations. And I think that it makes perfect sense that this is the movie that he made after Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, obviously, it's about the creation of the atomic bomb and the consequences of that. It's looking at it specifically through the lens of one man. I think that this movie is looking at the consequences of America creating the atomic bomb and then basically running the world for the next 80 years. I think it's looking at those consequences through the lens of a wider society. I think that that is the reason why everyone is speaking in an American accent. I think that's a very specific choice. You look at Guatemala, Vietnam, Indonesia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, the list goes on and on of all of these countries that the United States either helped set up coups in or directly invaded. A great book to learn a little bit more about some of this is Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He talks about how he worked as kind of a subsidiary of the CIA and would go into developing nations and offer them the Trojan horse of economic development. Hey, here we will help build roads, we'll help build railroads and telephone lines and all of this other infrastructure. But there's a catch. The catch is that we're going to control your natural resources. We're going to control your economy. We're going to control your government. You're going to be a subservient state to us. That is a pattern that, the United States has done since the end of World War II, the war that Oppenheimer helped win. So I think that this is a very logical next step for him. And I think that the end, and this is, I guess, a spoiler because he kind of changes a little bit. So this is the one spoiler warning I will give. The end where it is revealed that these sea peoples who are going around and raiding and breaking Zeus's law of treating everyone with respect and hospitality, that it's Matt Damon, that it is the Greeks. They're the ones who broke that law. And I think that that is the statement the movie's trying to make, is that there's this narrative, especially with people on the right now, that society is crumbling and that the migrant hordes are at the gates and threatening to destroy Western civilization and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, first of all, I mean, a lot of that's just fucking racism. But two, why do you think that there is a migrant crisis? Why do you think these people have left their homes? Because their homes have been destabilized and in some cases destroyed by Western intervention, by the Trojan horses that the West has planted there. So I thought it was a very relevant and insightful statement. So it's not a perfect film. Like I said, I think that the kind of perennial criticism of Nolan and his female characters and them kind of not having a lot to do and just kind of being there to serve the plot and be objects for the men to either pursue or be scared of. Yeah, I mean, that is true of this movie to some extent. I did think that the portrayal of Cersei was very good, and I liked how, she talked about how she didn't turn the men into pigs. She just revealed them for their true character. I thought that that was, one, a great performance, and two, a great statement. And I like what he did with her character. I think some of the other female characters, like the portrayal of Athena, for instance, is, I get ultimately what he does and how he reveals, at the end with why Odysseus is seeing her as Zendaya. I get why he did that. But in the book, Athena is much more of a conspirator. She's much more of a collaborator with Odysseus. She's gaming stuff out of okay, how are we going to do this? Here, I'm going to help you out and I'm going to give you a little bit, but I'm going to let you figure it out from there. That whole element is gone. Zendaya's just kind of hanging out. She's just kind of being pouty. She's just kind of being his conscience, I guess. And Penelope also, she just kind of is angry and wants Odysseus back, but she's not really, we don't see the craftiness. I mean, it kind of goes back to the portrayal of Odysseus because, Odysseus is this really clever and Machiavellian guy in the book, and Penelope is his match. They are equals. They're very equally yoked. And we don't really see that from Matt Damon. We also don't see that from Anne Hathaway. So that was another missed opportunity that I thought could have been handled differently, and I wish it was. Calypso is another character who in the text is a lot more interesting. In the movie, Charlize Theron, she's just kind of hanging out. And she doesn't get the speech that she gets in the book where she talks about the double standards that the gods have when it comes to men and women. And again, that would have been great to have in the movie too. I wish it had been included. So these are all complaints that Emily Wilson has made in her scathing review of the film. I agree with those complaints. There are other complaints she made that I didn't necessarily agree with. She kept bringing up how there weren't any sex scenes in the film. And there's a lot of sex scenes in the book, but look, it's a Hollywood blockbuster film. We can't see Matt Damon having sex with Calypso for 7 years and Cersei for 1 year, while pining for his wife and expecting her to stay faithful. The audience would turn on him so quickly. Are we robbing ourselves by being short-sighted in that? Like, would it have been a more interesting film? Yeah, probably. But I get why they're like, yeah, he has to stay faithful. I totally get that. Also, Nolan's just bad at filming sex scenes. Like the one in Oppenheimer, the first one, I almost laughed out loud in the theater because it was just so off-putting and awkward. So I wonder if maybe he got some of that note and was just like, I'm staying away from that in this film. Because, this is an R-rated film. They could have included it. But I think another point, too, is that like the original text of the Odyssey is uncomfortable for modern audiences. It just is. There is that element of Odysseus basically cheating on his wife for the whole time. There's also the element of slavery. Eumaeus is a slave. He's not called that in the film. He's called a servant. There's, slavery is just a part of life in this ancient world, and it's not looked down on at all. It's just seen as like, well, this is the natural order of things. And rightfully so, we today do not fuck with that. So I get why some of these changes were made. So the tone of Wilson's piece it felt really, really angry in a way that, I don't know, it felt personal. Like I wondered, I'm like, do you have some sort of personal vendetta going on here? Maybe that's true. I don't know. But you've probably seen those posts. You've probably seen those headlines. But let me ask you this. Did you actually read the entire piece? Because that brings me to my final point. So being the dedicated host that I am, I did track down and read Emily Wilson's piece in the London Review of Books. But if I was not prepping this episode, would I have done that? Maybe not. Maybe not. Because without having to seek it out, without going and looking for it, I had already absorbed kind of the main points that she had made. You probably had a similar experience where you saw the posts, where you saw the headlines. For that, and also for the piece I mentioned at the beginning, the article in The Atlantic called "The End of Reading is Here." Have you read that whole piece? I'm going to say you probably haven't, because I hadn't. I only read it because I was prepping for this episode. It's not an article that is going to make you feel good. It's filled with a lot of very scary figures and numbers and statistics and anecdotes about how even students at places like Harvard kind of lack the basic reading comprehension skills to make sense of books written less than 100 years ago. So I felt bad. I felt bad reading it. She makes the point that we're not necessarily becoming an illiterate society in that we're losing the ability to decipher, symbols on paper and make meaning out of it. What she's arguing is that we're becoming a post-literate society where we can decipher the symbols just fine, but we lack the cognitive and logic skills to engage with deeper texts and formulate our own opinions based on what we've read. So she says, quote, "The literate era will prove to be a brief interlude between the oral and digital ages," end quote. Not the sort of quote you want to hear when you are making a book podcast, I must say. Another article that I read as I was prepping for this that goes a little deeper into this idea of us entering a post-literate oral tradition is called "Democracy, Neo-Orality, and the Unraveling of Political Norms. What Can We Social and Political Scholars Do?" by Jacqueline Fent. She's a professor emeritus at ESCP University in Paris. In this paper, which was published in the Open Journal of Political Science in 2025, Fent uses the term neo-orality. And she says, quote, "By neo-orality, we mean not just a return to oral habits, but a deeper epistemic shift. It privileges immediacy over reflection, presence over argument, and shared emotional resonance over detached verification. Unlike classic orality, which relied on embodied presence, neo-orality travels across screens, memes, and live streams." So how does this relate to the Odyssey? Why am I talking about this? Well, when you read the text, you come across these remnants of the oral tradition. And the easiest place to see that is the epithets that are used for the characters, whether that's, sly Odysseus, wise Penelope, or even rose-fingered Dawn. That is mentioned. So I can't stress how many times rose-fingered Dawn is mentioned. These epithets, these little tiny nicknames, are very useful in the oral tradition because when you're sitting there and you're listening to this really long story with a lot of characters, when you hear those nicknames, you go, oh yeah, it's that guy. Oh yeah, it's that woman. I got it. I know where I'm at. It helps you know where you are. It helps you kind of clue in right away. And so you know where this is going. Obviously, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the master of these. In The End of Reading Is Here, Horowitz writes, quote, Trump's communication style is perfectly suited to an oral society. He employs epithets, low energy Jeb, little Marco, sleepy Joe, that are easy to remember and repeat. He contradicts himself as though there is no record of his previous statements. Even his writing is almost indistinguishable from his speech, end quote. Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is he is the perfect embodiment of post-literacy. I'm not convinced that he actually can read. I have not found convincing evidence of that. But whether he can or cannot, he still embodies that. He still embodies that, emotion trumps facts and logic, and that, the truth does not matter. The truth is just force. The truth is just emotion. He is the embodiment of that. Additionally, Fent adds, quote, neo-orality's political implications are profound. It collapses the distance between spectacle and truth, compresses deliberation into performance, and replaces the ethos of persuasion with the affective pull of belonging, end quote. And that gets to the heart of what the oral tradition is all about, which is creating a sense of identity. It's creating that sense of belonging. That is why I think the right, the far right, is so ascendant today, is that they understand that these stories, this kind of oral tradition, and I'm sorry for how many times I've said the word oral, there's going to be a lot more. The oral tradition, they understand that these simple, emotionally tinged stories matter more than facts, in that they create this group identity. And there's so much more power in that group identity. That's why it's so useless to try to fact check someone like Donald Trump, because you're going to spend all your time backpedaling, trying to say, well, no, actually, no, well, actually, no, well, actually, no, while he still just runs up the score on you. So that obviously that brings up the question, are we cooked? Horowitz seems to think so. Like I said, that essay is pretty depressing. It doesn't really give much hope. She talks about how, well, maybe we're shifting into, this next phase of human consciousness, and maybe that'll be a good thing, but probably not. I don't know. I mean, maybe. I do think that the onset of the internet is bringing about a phase shift in human consciousness, just in the way that the printing press and mass literacy did. So I do think we're in the midst of a massive paradigm shift, but I don't think we need or should give in to despair. In my own little way, I'm making a podcast about reading. I think it's worthwhile. I think it's more than just a hobby. I think it's something that allows you to expand your mind and expand your ability to reason and to look at the world and form your own opinions. I think reading is crucial for that. And so I think it's worth preserving, and maybe we're doomed. Maybe literacy is fucked, but I'm not ready to throw in the towel just yet. And if you've made it this far in this episode, I feel like you probably haven't either. That being said, I think it is important to understand the water we're swimming in, and that we are in a society where most people are not reading books. They are not forming their opinions on the world based on reading, well thought out arguments. And I think you could say, has that ever been true? Maybe not, but right now it's certainly not true. And so we need to be aware of that. And I think that politicians need to understand that and put that into practice. Someone who I think is doing a great job of that, who is meeting the moment and using that knowledge for good is Zoran Mamdani. I think that he is someone who very clearly understands the power of emotion and image and keeping it simple. Like, that's his whole thing. He keeps it simple, he stays on message, and he makes it fun. But I think that he's using those tools and techniques for good, whereas someone like Donald Trump is using them for evil. Would it be better if people were reading long books, long texts, and forming, classic syllogisms and logic and reasoning from that? Sure. Is that what's happening? No, it's not. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to meet that moment. So speaking of meeting moments, we've met the end of this episode. Much like Odysseus, we have wandered far from the path. I am recording this in the midst of a heat wave, and the sweat stains in my armpits that I'm very self-conscious about are evidence of that. And I do apologize for them. If you are listening just in the audio format, I should have cut this, but you know what? It stays in. But this feels like a good enough Ithaca to leave it. I think that the Odyssey is a perfect example of how the oral tradition is still alive, because think of all of the memes that you've seen. Think of all of the "somebody get these beggars out of here" memes, all of the, aura farming posts about Benny Safdie, all of the think pieces about how this movie didn't live up to the text or how it's problematic in some ways. Like, all of those pieces of content, all of those things people are saying are evidence of this neo-oral, post-literate moment that we're in. And in a strange way, I think that like Homer, if they existed, would be proud, because we are still telling this story. We're still changing it just a little bit every time we do. And we're still finding the heart of it, and we're still resonating with that. And we're still finding out that, even as things change, even as new technologies obsolesce old ones and create huge paradigm shifts and things get really scary, we are still, in essence, human. We're still the same. And I think there's comfort to be found in that. So this was a bit of a rambling episode. Thank you for sticking with it. And thank you all for watching and for listening. If you enjoy the Shoulda Book Club, this month we are reading Beloved by Toni Morrison, and I'm very excited to get into that. And as always, keep reading.